Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is entitled Transformations in Europe, 1500 to 1750. There are two major subpoints, culture and ideas, which is composed of early Reformation and also the Counter-Reformation and politics of religion. The other subpoint, social and economic life, is composed of the bourgeoisie, peasants and laborers, and women and families. So let's get started. The early Reformation. In 1500, the papacy, and by papacy we're talking about the Catholic Church here, the central government of Latin Christianity, held an unrivaled position in Europe's preeminent religious and intellectual authority, even though there was a lax clerical standard at the time, or clerical standards, and corruption were endemic, which any institution eventually is going to go through periods where there are problems, and by that I mean people, you can set out and say, okay, here are the rules by which we're going to operate, and people follow the rules, and then over time people start to fall away from those rules, at least in their behavior. And in this particular case, we're also going to see an increase in corruption, which means people are behaving in ways that are antithetical to what that institution stands for. In this case, it's going to be a church. All right. Popes now exercise great power, funded by large donations and by income from the church's enormous real estate holdings. Right? And that's going to literally allow them to construct 54 new churches and other buildings that demonstrated the church's wealth and power and showcased the artistic renaissance. An example of one of these buildings I want to talk about is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was built to glorify God. It's a display the skill of artists and builders and enhance the standing of the papacy. So there is a bit of, how do I want to put this? It's what image you want to project to the world. And your ability to construct all these buildings, and specifically the example of St. Peter's Basilica, is, there's the visual. It's awe-inspiring, right? And that's the image you want to project to people. So here, the overseer of design and the financing of this project is going to be Pope Leo X, who was ruled from 1513 to 1521. He's a member of the wealthy Medici family of Florence. He had an artistic taste that was superb and a personal life free from scandal. And this next point is to me fascinating. He's more a man of action than a spiritual leader, which to me says, when I read about him, he's more of an administrator. And all leaders have strengths and weaknesses. Some people are more organized, some people are less. When I read about Pope Leo X, I think a person who's a really good administrator, which means you can make projects happen. Church raised funds through the sale of indulgences. This is going to be very controversial. And what an indulgence essentially is it's forgiveness of punishment due for past sins. And so people are buying this. So you buy an indulgence in order to obtain forgiveness. And this is going to upset various people. One of those folks is going to be Martin Luther, the young professor of sacred scripture. He saw practice and other excesses in the church as intolerably corrupt. So Martin Luther lived from 1483 to 1546. So let's talk about him for a few minutes. He had forsaken money and marriage for a monastic life of prayer, self-denial, and study. Found personal consolation in the passage from St. Paul's epistle. And specifically here, salvation resulted from your religious faith. So you commit yourself to your beliefs. And that is what's going to, give you the salvation that you want. All right. And by belief, it's your actual belief in God here. All right. Wrote to Pope Leo to complain about the abuse and challenge the preachers to a debate. So essentially, he's going to be somewhat of an anomaly. My guess is, from what I've read, that there are going to be multiple people out there who take issue with Catholicism. Martin Luther is certainly one of those figures who has garnered more attention in historical retrospect. So when you start challenging people, what's going to happen is there's going to be pushback. In other words, the leadership is going to view you as an agitator and try to undercut your potential to generate more followers, right? Or at least leaders typically don't like it when people dissent, because when you dissent, then more people start asking questions, and that draws more attention to you, and it usually is negative attention. So Luther, who had written a letter that challenged the power of Pope Leo, of course, it's going to upset the Pope, and the Pope will move to silence Luther. Luther burned the bull, which is a document of condemnation, rejected the Pope's authority, and began the movement known as the Protestant Reformation. Insisted that the only way to salvation was through the faith in Jesus Christ, and declared that Christian belief should be based on the Word of God. He also made very effective use of the printing press to spread ideas and won the support of powerful Germans. So what's interesting is the Reformation as a movement is possible because there are other people out there who took issue with the Catholic Church. But figures like Martin Luther, they're able to actually, it's almost like, I don't know if it's happenstance, but they have the right ideas at the right moment. And then they engage in certain behaviors where they challenge the authorities. And then, of course, then there's going to be this groundswell of support. Because typically, if you're having those ideas, so is someone else out there, right? Now, how many people? That's what makes the difference. And there's a movement here. This Protestant Reformation is going to actually be a movement because there are many people who will share the views, or at least have views similar to Martin Luther, okay? In addition to Martin Luther, we also have to talk about John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564. A well-educated Frenchman who left the study of law for theology after his own conversion and became one of the most influential Protestant leaders. Denied that human faith alone could merit salvation, which is the gift God gave to those he predestined, and went further than Luther in curtailing the power of the clerical hierarchy and simplifying religious rituals. And here's something that a point I would like to make, is that any institution, most institutions, and specifically in this case the Catholic Church, are hierarchical in their design and orientation, which means think of a pyramid. And there's people higher up the pyramid who have more power and control, and people down the pyramid who have less power and control, right? And so we have these figures, people like Luther and Calvin, challenging that hierarchy, challenging that structure. And through these challenges, let's not kid ourselves, those challenges that they're offering are threatening. Because if you're used to occupying this position of power and authority, and someone comes along and starts to question you, then really what that's ultimately going to do is undercut your ability to control others, right? Okay, so with John Calvin, he believed congregations were elected their own, and he thought that congregations should elect their own governing committees and created regional national synods or councils to regulate doctrinal issues. He used controversy to strengthen his authority. And wait a second, I'm out of order here. Let's hold on here. When I reshuffled these pages, I got to go back. Okay, so I was like, that's not correct. Okay, so let's go back and reiterate here. Congregations under or according to John Calvin were elected their own governing committees and created regional and national councils to regulate doctrinal issues and displayed simplicity. These folks who are going to embrace Protestantism displayed simplicity in their personal dress, life, and worship, avoided ostentatious living while stripping churches of statues, musical instruments, stained glass windows, incense, and vestments. Right? Reformers appealed to the genuine religious sentiments, but successes and failures were also influenced by local political and economic conditions. It's no coincidence that the German-born Luther had his greatest success among German speakers and linguistically related Scandinavians. And Protestants were no more inclined than Roman Catholics to question male dominance in the church and family, but they rejected the medieval tradition of celibate priests and nuns. And they advocated that regardless of who you were in the church, all adults should get married. All right? Okay, so the Counter-Reformation and politics of religion, because if you've read about this and you're thinking about what I've said thus far, you know that the Catholic Church is going to push back against folks who are agitating with these different ideas, push back against the Martin Luthers and the John Calvins and all of their supporters, right? So Counter-Reformation and politics of religion. Shaken by the intensity of the Protestant attack, the Catholic Church initiated a campaign of internal reforms. The influential church council met in Trent, which we call the Council of Trent, in northern Italy in 1545. This is going to go on for a series of years, though, right? Disrupted by political events and the outbreak of typhus, which is a disease, relocated in Bologna in 1547, but a dispute between the Pope and Charles V, who was known as the Holy Roman Emperor, made progress difficult. So we have a political struggle here of sorts. So they reassembled in Trent in 1551, but they were able to this meeting lasted for less than 7 months. So really it's a group of people getting together and trying to rethink rethink how the organization of the Catholic Church and the doctrines and so forth, and revisiting its operation. All right, so final session, January 1562 and December of, well, the final session lasted between January 1562 and December of 1563, so not quite 2 years. So they distinguished Catholic doctrines from what members saw as Protestant errors, okay, and reaffirmed the supremacy of the Pope. So not much is going to change here. And it's not surprising, because oftentimes when you ask people to engage in some form of reflection, if they think what they're doing is correct, they're not inclined to stray too far from the way they've conducted business. In institutions, in political science, we talk about what's called path dependence. And when I read about this, it makes me think of path dependence, this concept that, well, we've operated a certain way for so long, we're going to continue to operate that way. And when you ask people to reflect on what they're doing, and that includes what they're doing wrong, people aren't necessarily as good, not all people are as good at admitting fault. So they reaffirm the teaching, including the salvation through faith and good works, the importance of oral confession and penance, and authorities interpreting scriptures. So when we say the authorities interpreting scriptures, that means people who are clerics, people in their very specific roles within the church. They're the ones that are going to disseminate ideas to lay people, average everyday people. Okay. Bishops allied with the Pope dominated the council and limited efforts to reform practices that Luther had condemned as corrupt. The creation of a new religious order, which is called the Society of Jesus, or also the group collectively known as Jesuits, by the Spanish nobleman Ignatius of Loyola, who lived from 1491 to 1556. A couple points here. Among the most important events of the Catholic Reformation, creating the Society of Jesus, helped stem the Protestant tide by their teaching and gain converts through missions to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So this is where we talk about Catholicism is dominant in Europe, but it's going to spread out to other parts of the world. And we know that Catholicism will eventually take root in places like Southeast Asia and definitely in Central and South America. Both sides persecuted and sometimes executed those with differing views. Bitter wars of religion would continue in part of Western Europe until 1648. It's not uncommon. Think about this for a second. If faith is central to a person's life, and you are part of this collective, like a church, and then you encounter people who think differently, not a lot of folks necessarily have the capacity to accept other people for their different ideas, especially when people take faith so personally. This speaks to this issue of why people are inclined to get into arguments over religion. I mean, those can be some very, very delicate conversations to navigate because people take it very personally and they can get upset very easily. So it shouldn't be a surprise that folks are inclined to persecute. Plus, you have to think about this too. We did have formal governing institutions at this time, of course, because faith is intertwined with politics. And politics, when I say that, I mean actual governing apparatus. What I want to say here, though, is the institutions that would protect individuals, this whole concept of a right has yet to emerge. So the way we think in these terms, like right, the concept of a right as we understand it in the 2020s is not the way that people are looking at the world in the 15, 16, or 1700s. Now, eventually these rights are going to come out of the Enlightenment, the concept of a right will, which is still a little ways off, especially when we're talking about the 15 or 1600s. Early 1600s. So I bring this up for a reason. Persecuting people, I mean, as much as I and today I find that to be, as a human being, morally abhorrent. I think about it in those terms. The institutions in law did not exist that we understand today in today's context. So it's not surprising that people could do that to someone else, and it would be, I don't necessarily want to say, well, maybe the word accepted isn't necessarily the right word to use here, but it would be more legally and politically permissible because there were fewer laws protecting people because of what they happen to believe, if that makes any sense. Okay, so Charles V and his son, King Philip II of Spain, were key political and military architects of the Counter-Reformation. To confront the Protestant threat in Northern Europe, Charles V dialed back his campaign against the Ottoman Empire and the North African Muslim states in the Mediterranean and sent large armies to Central Europe. And then Philip II continued his father's policies to their disastrous ends, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Then we have King Henry VIII, whom if you look at the image that I've used here behind the text on the screen, that is actually Henry VIII, King of England, when he met Anne Boleyn. It's a painting capturing that event, right? So King Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547, had initially been the strong defender of the papacy against Lutheran criticism. However, that's going to change, and of course that's going to change depending on one's personal life. And what does that mean? He failed to obtain a papal annulment of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had not furnished him with a male heir, challenged the papacy's authority over the church. In other words, we have a personal issue. So King Henry VIII wants to get divorced, and the church doesn't want to recognize it. So this is what's going to be the reason why he's going to separate. The English Archbishop of Canterbury annulled Henry's marriage in 1533, and the Parliament made the king head of the autonomous Church of England. So this is where we're going to see the advent of the Church of England, which is really, when you think about this action, it is a major departure. I mean, to see a king take issue. Think about it. Martin Luther or John Calvin, the social stature that they have is nowhere near what a king would have. So when the king starts to take issue, that's where we see, that in and of itself is a major threat. I mean, Luther and Calvin are going to be threats to the Catholic Church. And of course, these individuals are going to have their own supporters. But when you see a major political figure like a king, that's a different situation and far more serious, especially when they're going to create their own church. Right, so used his controversy to strengthen his authority and fatten his pocketbook. That's King Henry VIII here. By closing monasteries and convents and seizing their lands. He gave some of the land to his powerful allies and used profits from selling of other land to pay for his new navy. Okay, we're going to move on to social and economic life. The bourgeoisie. By 1700, both Paris and London had populations over 500,000, and 11 other European cities contained over 100,000 people. So we're seeing a lot of growth because people are moving there for opportunities. Now, of course, when you go there, you're going to find a high level of poverty, but people are seeking out opportunities. Cities offer that. Certainly, in some cases, more than what you're going to find in the countryside. Urban wealth came from manufacturing and finance, but especially from trade, both within Europe and overseas. The French called urban class that dominated these activities the bourgeoisie, or the burghers, known as town dwellers. They devoted long hours to their businesses and poured much of their profits back into them or new ventures. So, I'm thinking these people are going to be financially successful. When we talk about bourgeoisie, you hear that term used. People, even today, you still hear the term used, but when we say bourgeoisie, we're talking about like a professional class of people who have accumulate a certain level of wealth. They're making money, and then they have that money to invest in other places, right? Had enough money to live comfortably in large houses, and some had servants. The wealthier consumers could buy luxuries imported from the far corners of the earth. We're talking about, think about this. If you have that disposable income, you can spend it on sugar and rum from the Caribbean and Brazil, on chocolate from Mexico, tobacco from Virginia, furs from North America, textiles and spices from East Indian cotton, textiles and spices, and then the Chinese tea and porcelain. You have the disposable income to spend. And you're living better than an awful lot of people across Europe. Because don't kid yourself, the folks here, there's going to be prosperity, but prosperity for some people, not everyone. Not everyone. Not everyone's going to be living like this. So we want to make sure that we characterize this properly. In the Netherlands, they provided one of the best examples, like specifically the Dutch Republic, retained nobility, and wealthy commoners dominated its economy and politics. Manufacturers turned out in great variety of goods in their factories and workshops. The successful textile industry concentrated on the profitable weaving, finishing, and printing of cloth, leaving the spinning to low-paid workers elsewhere, and also made cheaper textiles for mass markets. So when you can mass produce any good, remember, then you can produce more of it for less money to then distribute far and wide to people living in other places, i.e. this is other markets. The Dutch developed huge commercial fleets that dominated the sea trade. Around 1600, they introduced new ship designs, including the Fluit, or also known as the flyboat, a large capacity cargo ship that was inexpensive to build and required only a small crew. As trade with distant markets developed, they introduced another successful type of merchant ship, the heavily armed East Indiaman, is what it's called, East Indiaman, that helped establish supremacy in the Indian Ocean, supplanting Portugal. Because initially the Portuguese were doing a lot of exploring. Remember, the Portuguese were responsible for helping kick off the slave trade that would eventually become dominant source of labor in the Caribbean and what's now the United States. Okay, so we have the Dutch, and these countries are in competition with one another. I mean, there's the element, there's the financial gain people have, then there's also the world prestige, or the prestige on a world stage, right? You want to extend your influence. I mean, people are driven by what they can accumulate and what they can control. So, conducted more than half of the ocean-going commercial shipping in the world in the 17th century. This is the Dutch, of course, and improvements in map making, and that's Dutch map making, supported these commercial connections. So the more you explore and the more ships, I mean, think about this, it all builds on itself, really, because if you've got these markets, and if these markets exist, and then you're able to build these ships, and the ships can take you to various places, and then you get better with developing maps so that you have a better understanding of where you're traveling to. This is all intertwined, so it affords you the opportunity to make more money. And really, when you think about map making, that's a technological development worthy of mentioning. All right, Amsterdam also served as a financial center. Banks had such a reputation for security, the wealthy individuals, banks had such a reputation for security that wealthy individuals and governments entrusted them with their money and invested the funds in real estate, loaned money to factory owners and governments, and provided capital for commercial operations overseas. Remember, banks loan money to people and they'll make money on the interest when you're repaying the loan. But the money that banks also have on hand, they can turn around and invest. And when they invest, that's another opportunity to grow other businesses while they're also making their own money or additional money. Okay? So what we have is real serious growth of a market in the European context. But also remember this, part of what makes these markets possible are the goods that are coming from different parts of the world, as I just mentioned earlier. Like, for example, tea and porcelain in China or tobacco in Virginia. These goods are coming from everywhere or from other places. Because Europe can't provide all of this by itself. Okay? So part of that European success is predicated upon what efforts have been made successfully to explore different regions of the world and make connections with other people and establish, like a trade route. And of course, there has to be a market back where you are from, because people have got to want to buy it, which they do. They do want to buy it because these trade routes and these connections to other parts of the world afford people this opportunity to buy goods that they can't get there at home. Okay. Governments also sought to promote trade by investing in infrastructure, because this is very important. The Dutch built numerous canals to speed transport, lower costs, and drain the lowlands for agriculture. After 1650, the Dutch faced growing competition from the English, who were developing their own close association between business and government. The English merchant fleet doubled between 1660 and 1700, and foreign trade rose by 50%. So now the English are becoming major contenders in this game. Right? So the Portuguese, the Dutch, now we're talking about the English. We mentioned the Portuguese, I should say. State revenue from customs duties tripled, supporting the growth of the Navy. So, in other words, you're making money off of trade. Remember, government has to get something out of this too. That's why you have a customs duty, right? So that money is a revenue stream for government. And when government has more and more money coming in, it can invest some of that money in its Navy in this case, which is part of what's going to allow Britain to build up the Navy that it has. Definitely by the 1700s here. In a series of wars, this is between 1652 and 1678, the English government used this new naval might to break the Dutch dominance in overseas trade and extend England's empire. So they're able to do that. This is from the 1600s into the 1700s. All right, I want to talk a bit about peasants and laborers. Serfdom is going to be on the decline. If you remember, when you're a serf, you're essentially a peasant living on this manor that's owned by a lord, and you're working the land. And the lord provides you with protection, but the existence you have as a peasant is very bleak because you don't own that land. And maybe you have a bit of surplus that you grow that you're able to sell for supplemental income, but for the most part, you're relatively poor, and then you're living in, a house. And really, when I say house, that's probably an overstatement. You're living in a small building that doesn't have many amenities. Okay, talked a bit about this before. But serfdom, which bound men and women to the land owned by a local lord, had begun to decline in Europe after the Great Plague of the mid-14th century. Remember, that's this 1300s, around 1340s, 1350s, early 1350s. Increased competition for work exerted a downward pressure on wages, reducing the usefulness of serfdom and other forms of forced labor. The legal freedom did little to make peasants' life safer and more secure. Because think about this. The Lord was providing you, even though you're forced into this rigid social order where you don't have many options available to you and you're struggling to get by, the Lord did provide you with some protection and you did have shelter, of course. But the problem here is that, yes, serfdom is on the decline and will eventually disappear, but that does not mean that you are in a secure financial position as a peasant. It's still going to be a very difficult life. That's what I want to say here. Efficiency of agriculture improved little since 1300. Bad years brought drought and famine. Famine, and of course, that's a problem. And good ones provided only small surpluses. So famine. I should not have said drought there. Sorry. Material conditions experienced by the poor worsened between 1500 and 1750 because of warfare, environmental degradation, and economic contractions. We talk about there are times when the economy is growing and times when it's, in this case, the word is contracting. But when you're growing, there's more business, there's more opportunity, and more people are making more money. But when there's a contraction, that means fewer people are making money and businesses aren't hiring as many people, and sometimes businesses cease to exist. They go under. Okay, I want to mention this here too. Europeans also felt the adverse effects of a century of relatively cool climate that began in the 1590s, which is called the Little Ice Age. Other rural residents made a living as miners, lumberjacks, and charcoal makers. The iron industry in England provided work for all three, But the high consumption of wood, because you've got to burn the wood for the smelting process, caused serious deforestation, because in order to get that wood to burn, you've got to cut down a lot of trees. Eventually, the high price of wood and charcoal encouraged smelters to use coal as an alternative fuel. England's mining increased 12-fold. In 1550, there's 210,000 tons produced. In 1700, 2.5 million tons, and in 1750, 5 million tons. So we're talking about a serious industry. But remember, there's always negative, we oftentimes refer to them as externalities or negative externality in public policy. And it doesn't matter if that's a more contemporary term, because it still applies in this context. Industrial growth always brings with it both positive and negative effects, right? Positive effects, it puts people to work. Negative effects, it contributes to deforestation in this case, right? Even in the prosperous Dutch towns, half of the population lived in acute poverty, which goes back to a point I made a few minutes ago. So many people are going to be poor in these cities. All right, so authorities estimated that the permanent city residents who were too poor to tax, so poor they weren't taking any money from them, made up to 10, maybe even 20% of the population, so perhaps as many as 1 in 5. And that might vary from one city to the next, depending on the opportunities available. But think of it this way: 1 out of 5 people is so poor the government doesn't want to collect taxes from them. This did not include migrants, peddlers, and beggars. So that means there's even more people beyond that potential 1 out of 5. This shocked people who were not hardened to it. In other words, if you're not accustomed to seeing that kind of poverty, it's going to bother you. And that some of those folks who are bothered by it are going to have more of a reformer mindset. What can we do to address it? Widespread misery provoked many rebellions in the early modern Europe. Peasant rebels in the Alps attacked nobles and clergy as representatives of the privileged and the landowning classes. So not even the clergy were exempt from this. I can understand why people get upset with nobles, but the clergy, typically people, you might be living a decent life depending on how much money the church has, and not only just how much it has, but how much it's distributed to various places. But the clergy are not going to be exempt, which means angry peasants might go after people affiliated with the church, not just the nobles or the wealthier folks. And also these people, the peasants, these rebels, had no love for merchants either, whom they denounced for lending at interest and charging high prices. So you think about that. If you're struggling to get by and you go to the store and you think you're paying an exorbitant amount for whatever good, or when you have to borrow, essentially it's an early form of credit, and then you're charged a higher level of interest, that's going to upset people, right? Rebellions multiplied across Europe and rural conditions worsened. In southwest France in particular, there were some 450 uprisings occurred between 1590 and 1715. I want to say this much, and I think it's worth bringing up. Today, we have a very low threshold for political violence. But if you look back at like the 1500s, 1600s, and so forth, in early 1700s, we're talking about hundreds of rebellions where people are actually using physical force, i.e. violence, in order to communicate their discontent to leaders, whether that be political leaders or religious leaders. What that means is people are struggling to get by. And when they cannot provide for themselves, their families, or maybe we'll rephrase it, their families or themselves, they're going to get very angry, and you're going to find that anger come to the surface in the form of violence. This is something, I think it is worth mentioning. I bring this up because when you look at, I'll just speak broadly, whether we're talking about world civilization or even U.S. history in particular, there are many examples of political violence that results for economic or religious, whatever. There's violence that results for a lot of different reasons, and there are many examples. Many of these uprisings are going to be set off by food shortages and tax increases. Because think about that. If you don't have enough food to sustain yourself, and then someone's asking you to pay more by way of taxation in your community, That's going to upset people. All right, women and family. We're going to talk about this. It's the last, I guess you could say, sub point. Or let's see here. Women's social and economic status was closely tied to that of their husbands. Class and wealth defined a woman's position in life more than sex, though. The wife or daughter of a rich man had a materially better life than a poor man. So that's something to keep in mind here. And this is why I always like to bring up the issues. As a trained social scientist, I like to think in terms of what are the factors that influence the way a person's life is going to unfold. And certainly we could talk about race as a factor. We could talk about gender, and we could talk about class. Those are three big factors that definitely, get a lot of attention in the social sciences. My question I've often asked myself is how much of which and in which specific circumstance are we talking about? Because we can't just rush in and say, well, it's this and it's only this, right? And that's why when I was reading about the text I wrote these notes from, when you read, wife or daughter of a rich man had a materially better life than any poor man. So think about this. In a community, there's going to be people in this social order of higher or lower class. So if you are in a bourgeois family or you're a member of the bourgeoisie and you're the wife of a man who owns a shop or is involved in banking or whatever this person might happen to be involved in, you by extension are going to be living at a better standard than a peasant is anywhere across Europe, right? And so yes, women are subordinate to men in this particular social order. However, the life you're going to experience is going to be better than that of a peasant. Does it make sense? Now, when I say this, I'm speaking as a historian. And also, I got a foot in both worlds, remember. I have a degree in history and a degree in political science, so I think in both terms. And sometimes I'm getting pulled in different directions the way I think about each of them. It's important for me to mention this here, though, because it does beg the question. I mean, clearly, when we think in terms of gender, especially in the 2020s, we think in terms of equality, but that concept did not exist at this particular point in time, which is not to say that it's acceptable. I'm not suggesting for any moment here in any capacity that women are subordinate to men. I'm saying that equality as we understand it did not exist then. So that's worth mentioning. And of course, it's also worth mentioning here as well, or reiterating that we have a wife of a banker is going to be that better than that of, in at least in terms of your standard of living, is going to be better than that of a peasant. Okay. And of course, down the road, we're going to see calls for changes in the law and greater political rights. Okay. Some widows independently controlled substantial properties and other assets. So that's important to mention here too. Arranged marriages that prevailed in much of the world, young men and women in early modern Europe often chose their own spouses. Now, this is where we're getting some nuances here. All right, privileged families were much more likely to arrange marriages than poor ones. The bourgeoisie promoted marriages that advanced their social aspirations or furthered their business interests. Now, it's not necessarily going to be arranged in terms of we're going to pick the partner for you, but if you think about this for a second, you're operating within a social class, and there's going to be this social force on you, or pressure perhaps, to marry within that class. Does it make sense? So even if there isn't a situation where parents are picking out a partner for someone, there's still a social pressure to choose someone who's a member of the class that you belong to. That's how I could phrase it. And there's great financial interest in this. All right. Europeans also married later than people in other regions. Sons often put off marriage until they could live on their own. And many women also had to work to save money for the dowry, which is the money and household goods that enabled them, a couple, to begin their marriage independent of their parents, expected by potential husbands. Now, people getting putting off their marriage is also going to hold down the birth rate and limit family size, which is an interesting development. You think about it. So people are getting married later, and then their families are not going to be as large, which means the birth rate is being cut a bit. About 1 in 10 of urban births were to unmarried women, often servants. Many mothers, unable to provide for these infants, left them on the doorsteps of churches, convents, and rich households to be raised as orphans. And that's where we're going to end with this particular presentation. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to remind you, there we go, let's phrase this properly. I want to remind you, if you look in the description section below the video, you're going to see a series of resources I found if you want to read more about this particular topic. Thank you so much for listening. Peace.